Whether it's TV or literature, how long is it fair for a creator to ask you to stick with a series before it gets good? Gardens of the Moon, written by Steven Erikson and published in 1999, is the first book of 8 published books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, which is projected to be 10 books in total. I have always romanticized the idea of going into a book cold, having no idea what lays in store for you when you crack that first page, and then getting swept away and just, no expectations. You don't know what's coming, and everything is just between you, the author, and your imagination. I I've thought that is, the purest, best way to go into a book. This book, Gardens of the Moon, has made me rethink that idea. At least for some books, I think having your expectations set is incredibly important, because what I would tell you if you're thinking about reading this book, and what I wish someone had told me, is that this book is not a complete story. This book is the prologue. It is a 500-page prologue to a 10-book series. Gardens of the Moon, in a nutshell, without spoilers, is the story of set in, a classic fantasy swords and wizards world. You have a evil human empire intent on global domination. This empire is long established and has been expanding and conquering, and it seems inevitable that it will ultimately control the entire world. And we're following not one protagonist, but a whole array of protagonists. This book on its own, I think you could argue there isn't even a protagonist. Instead, we're cutting, even within a chapter, we're cutting between a bunch of different characters. And normally when we jump from one character to another, we're being transported to a completely different region. It's not, you see one person's side of a conversation and then you cut to the other person's perspective. No, these are disparate characters in totally different places, often doing, all going about their own journeys. Somewhat mostly simultaneously. The city of Darujitsun is where this evil empire, the Malazan Empire, has turned its lustful gaze, and it is determined to take Darujitsun. And this story is about all of our disparate cast of characters, good, bad, everything in between, making their way to Darujitsun. And by the end of the novel, most of them have arrived in the city. And specifically, the climax of the novel takes place at a house party that a lot of the characters are either attending or sneaking into. This book is so clearly teeing up the series that I don't think it works as a book in its own right. I think the only appropriate time to read this book is if you're going to go on to read the series. I would never recommend someone read just this book. Unlike, there's a series called The Chronicles of Amber, the first book of which is Nine Princes of Amber. Nine Princes of Amber absolutely ends on a cliffhanger. It absolutely tees up the rest of the series. However, it is an entire and complete story in its own right. And it's the best story in The Chronicles of Amber. I totally wholeheartedly recommend that you read Nine Princes in Amber without any need to read the rest of the series. This is not that. This is very much just part one in a bigger story, and if you're not planning to read the bigger story, I don't know how much you would be able to get out of part one on its own. This world is very interesting, and there are points that absolutely go in this book's favor, and almost all of them are oriented around Erikson's world building. Part of what makes Erikson's world so original and feel so novel in my mind is the presence of gods. There is this vast, I don't even want to call it a pantheon because it doesn't seem to be fixed, but there is this realm of gods. It reminds me of the way that Ovid presents the Roman gods in his work Metamorphoses. They're petty, they're feuding, they interfere and interact with the human world only for their own benefit. They do not care about humans at all. It's kind of like the Greek pantheon in that it seems like maybe the gods derive some benefit from human worship. So to that end, they care about human beings the tiniest iota. It seems gods can be killed in this world, it also seems like mortal beings can be elevated to God status. I'm not sure about that. But a few things in the book seem to hint at the possibility of beings, being ascending to some sort of godhood themes. Despite Gardens of the Moon falling into the category of grimdark fantasy, which is apparently characterized by a lot of moral grayness and cynicism, I actually think morality is a central theme of Gardens of the Moon, and that makes a lot of sense because, like I said, it's the introduction to these characters and them embarking on their respective journeys. And in that sense, they're kind of each receiving their, call to action. And what that looks like for a lot of these characters is making a decision about what they consider right and what they consider wrong. And then whether or not they feel compelled to resist or fight that which they perceive to be wrong. And for one character, this actually explicitly takes the form of having a moment of epiphany that justice and morality might be a fixed thing, a real thing that exists in the world and isn't just a matter of opinion. Around the middle of the book, we have a character walking on his own in like a desert, and he thinks to himself the following: some things went beyond a single man's life, and maybe justice existed outside the minds of humanity, beyond even the hungry eyes of gods and goddesses, a thing shining and pure and final. Some philosophers he'd read during his schooling in the Malazan capital, Unta, had asserted that what seemed to him then an absurd position. Morality was not relative, they claimed, nor even existing solely in the realm of the human condition. No, they proclaimed morality as an imperative of all life, a natural law that was neither the brutal acts of beasts nor the lofty ambitions of humanity, but something other, something unassailable. Now, obviously, it's a mistake to equate a character's opinion with an author's opinion, so I'm not trying to necessarily assert that Erikson is using this book to say those things, but I do think it's kind of borne out in not just this one character who's contemplating the possibility that morality is objective, but other characters have similar moments of self-discovery, though none stated quite so expressly as we get in that description. My thoughts. I think I've hinted pretty clearly at what I consider the book's fatal flaw, and I'll harp on it a little more before I'm through, but I do have a couple miscellaneous grievances I wanted to quickly note. There's a really big cast of characters, and maybe this is a result of having such a large cast of characters, and maybe it gets fleshed out more over the course of the series. But in this book alone, I found the characters to be more than two-dimensional, but definitely not complex. There's not a lot of character growth, which is not surprising given that it's only the beginning of a story. Two characters, the main one who, had this moral epiphany, you definitely see growth out of. And then there's another character that you see growth from. But even the growth that you see is pretty plot driven. Like it doesn't necessarily feel earned. And likewise, there's a love story. There's only one love story. There's only one romance arc in the book, and it definitely does not feel earned. There's a brief hint that these two characters are like physically attracted to each other, but then suddenly out of nowhere they are in love, and that love becomes the impetus for one of the characters having this turn toward wanting to resist the evil empire, and that it feels very contrived, and like that romance was just necessary for the plot. It was very much a tell don't show. The author's like, these characters are in love, and you just go, okay, I suppose they are. Another tiny criticism I have, which is probably unique to me, or maybe not unique to me, but is definitely a matter of personal taste. Erikson makes it clear from the very beginning of this book that death in this world is not necessarily final. And for my personal taste, if once you start playing it loosey-goosey with death, it's hard for me to really feel serious stakes when the characters are out doing their daring deeds. Now, after a video that's been predominantly criticism, I want to hit on a few things that are not just done well, but I would argue done exceptionally well. And that pretty much starts and ends with the world building. The world building is vast in scope, and also the lore is rich. So you've got a big world with rich lore. You've got a complex magic system, a complex system of gods, a complex system of, different warring cultures and different types of beings. Humans don't necessarily seem to be the only sentient things that exist. And there's also kind of a deep history of evolution, not just of cultures, but of the inhabitants of this world, that's hinted at. All of that is remarkably impressive. And it's so clear to me that this first book is just a tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg of the world that Erikson has dreamed up. Okay, so incredible world building, great themes, maybe not the most robust characters, but that can be fleshed out in future books. So why am I so hard on Malazan Book of the Fallen? Well, to jump ahead, let me just say this. My rating is 4 out of 10 bicorns. The experience of this book was like going to a restaurant that brings you free bread or free chips as soon as you sit down. And then by the time the waiter comes around to get your order, you decide you're not even going to order an entree because you filled up on bread and chips. This book was chips and salsa for me, and I'm full. I'm confident Erikson could deliver a great entree. I'm sure later books in this series do get good, but I've got a lot of books that I want to read in my lifetime, and Erikson had 500 pages of my time, and he didn't tell me a complete story that left me wanting more, and he didn't introduce me to characters that I got particularly invested in and wanted to spend more time with. So for those reasons, for now, I'm out. There is one last thing to do before we go, and that's discuss the cover art. Cover art, actually, I'm pretty happy with it. This illustration, lets you know what you're in for. It's clearly going to be a fantasy story, and that's fun. And yet, as far as I can tell, this is not a depiction of any particular location or scene from the book, which I think is fun. It just kind of gives you a sense of the world. I don't like the author's name being so much bigger than the book's name. I'd rather that be flipped. I wouldn't mind Malazan Book of the Fallen being a little more dominant. I wouldn't mind seeing like book 1, Malazan Book of the Fallen. But overall, good cover, fun cover. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a like, because while the AI decides what we all watch, it lets us vote.